This is the story of Spaghetti the Yeti and the Meatball. Once upon a time, there lived a Yeti way on top of a mountain whose name was Spaghetti. Spaghetti the Yeti. He was the biggest fellow around, no one could do anything about it, and for the most part, he was happy. But there was just that one thing that he was not happy about. He knew that his name was Spaghetti, and he knew that the thing that went best with spaghetti was a meatball. Oh, he'd heard about meatballs, and even though he didn't know what one was, he knew that meatballs went well with spaghetti. Whether they were meaty meatballs or veggie meatballs, everyone knew that spaghetti always needed one. And one day, he was telling his woes to a goat when the goat glanced at him, rolled its eyes, as goats are very good at doing, and said, "Why don't you just go to the bottom of the mountain?" At which point Spaghetti the Yeti did the only thing he could do. He inhaled deeply and promptly passed out. Once he came to, though, he sat up and looked at the goat and said, "Wait, say that again." And the goat said, "Well, at the bottom of the mountain, there's a whole great big wide world out there." Spaghetti the Yeti stared at him because he'd only lived his entire life on top of the mountain and had never stopped to wonder if there was something else. So he thought, and he thought, and he decided, yes, he would do it. He would go down the mountain. But it looked an awful long way, and he didn't know if his legs would get tired, so he did the only thing he could do. He grabbed some wheels, grabbed some boots, put the wheels on the boots, put the boots on the hoofs of the goat, put a saddle on the goat's back, and, well, clambered on and rode the goat down the mountain. And soon enough, he was all the way down there. And it was more magnificent than he'd ever imagined. But it was also a little bit off. He narrowed his eyes and looked up and put his hands on his hips and said, "You're really slacking off, you know." Because as he clearly knew on top of a mountain, the ground is supposed to be covered in snow. But this ground wasn't covered in snow. It was covered in some weird green stuff. Well, he picked up his foot and reached out with it, and it just felt weird under his feet. But he knew he had to go, so he started to walk over it like a dog wearing booties, until the goat finally walked over to him and rolled its eyes. "What is this stuff?" he said. "It's grass," the goat replied. "Most people it's just decorative, but we goats like to eat it sometimes." And this gave Spaghetti the Yeti an idea. He went over to a tree and grabbed some branches, put them around the goat's mouth in a very certain way so that he could open and close it when he needed to, picked up the goat, shoved its face into the ground, and had it eat the grass and form a nice path for him to walk along. Soon enough, on his merry little way, though, he had to stop. Because, being a Yeti, he'd always lived on top of a mountain, and he knew that water came in one of two forms. Either it was white and it was snow and it stayed on the ground, or it was more see-through and it was ice and it stayed on the ground. But this water was different. He glared at it, put his hands on his hips, and said, "You're not supposed to be doing this, you know. Someone should complain to your manager, because this water flowed along the ground instead." And he looked at the goat that he put on the ground, and he said, "What's this then?" And the goat rolled its eyes and said, "It's a river. You either swim and you get across, Or you sink and you don't. But that is the way of life. Now, Spaghetti the Yeti knew that he couldn't swim, and he didn't really know what else to do. So he did the only logical thing he could. He picked up the goat, and he threw it in the river. And wouldn't you know it, because the goat's fur was so thick to trap so much hair inside of it, he floated rather well. So Spaghetti the Yeti grabbed a big stick, got into the saddle, and rode the goat across the river. And when he got across, the goat was feeling very cross. "I have had it," the goat said. "You've ridden me down the mountain, you've used me like a lawnmower, and now you've rode me across the river. I am leaving." But the hard thing with having wheels on shoes on your hooves is that it's rather hard to move with them. "Can you give me a push, at least?" the goat asked. "Why, yes," said Spaghetti the Yeti, who's always very helpful, and he gave the goat a push. Ignoring the screams and sudden crashing sounds down the way, he stared at the thing in front of him. His eyes narrowed, and his hands went on his hips, and he said, "You're not mountaining right. I think you should be fired." For there was indeed a mountain in front of him, but unlike his own mountain, which sloped gently down to the valley below, this one was a cliff, straight up and down. And he thought about it, and he knew he could climb it. After all, he had claws that he could stick in and use to get a good grip. But if he did that, his poor claws would be worn down to nothing, and then what would he do? So he thought, and he thought, and he thought. And then he realized, goats have horns, and horns are very sharp. So he walked down the path until he found the goat lying on the ground where it had crashed into a rock. He picked it up, and he carried it back. And he looked up at the cliff and down at the goat, and he picked it up and reached it up, and he slammed it into the mountain and pulled himself up. Then he took it out, and he slammed it into the mountain and pulled himself up, and he slammed it into the mountain, and he pulled himself up until at last he reached the top, where he dropped the highly likely to be unconscious and probably concussed goat on the ground and looked around. And what did he see but a snowman? "Hello," said Spaghetti the Yeti. And the snowman waved back, but having arms made out of twigs, it couldn't really bend them. "Hello," it said back. "My name is Spaghetti the Yeti," he said. And the snowman inhaled deeply. But it did not pass out. "My name," it said, "is Meatball the Snowman." Oh, and Spaghetti and Meatball were so happy to finally find each other, for they each had known that Spaghetti and Meatball are incomplete without the other, and they very soon became fast friends. But they encountered a little problem, for you see it was a very long journey to go from Spaghetti's mountain down to the valley, across the grass, across the river, and up the mountain, up to Meatball's home, and then down the mountain, across the river, across the grass, and up the mountain to Spaghetti's home. So they did the only logical thing they could. They built a bridge across to connect them both, with a nice little set of grooves in the middle, perfectly sized for wheels, and they rode the goat back and forth whenever they wanted to see each other. The end.